So thank you so much for coming. We have so far the sessions of this conference have given rise to excellent dialogues. I hope you also have the same feeling. Our coordinator's proposal of discussing the relations between housing and architecture from the starting point of terminology has made it possible to investigate how terms travel in time and space. This strategy has allowed us to investigate different meanings of terms that terms takes on all over the course of history and in different territories as well. This allows us to construct historically and geographically situated point of views, which placed in touch with each other, produce convergences, also dissonance and frictions, and that make us think a lot. And we had very intense discussions during the parallel sessions. So for me, at least, the process have been very interesting until now. I believe for the group here, that I can see, we can see each other here in this webinar. We are sorry we can't see everyone, but it's a way of making it more available so that more people can attend to it. So it has been very enriching and we hope that also for you. Now what I would like to do is to introduce Silke Kapp, and before introducing her, thanks her a lot to be here with us, even in this remote format, in a difficult time, I think, for all of us all over the world, and perhaps particularly in Brazil, because we've been facing many difficulties before the pandemic, and so now we have the pandemic and the other problems. So thank you so much for being available and to be here to share with us your thoughts that for sure will help us a lot in the work we've been doing for the last, I don't know, more than 10 months already, isn't it? With this research group that was suggested by EIL, Suzanne and Gaia, and also I'd like to thank them a lot for initiating this process and everyone that made it possible for us to be here today. And so Silke Kapp is an architect and a PhD in philosophy with postdoctoral research in urban sociology. Since 2003, she has been a professor at the School of Architecture of the Federal University of Minas Gerais in Brazil. In 2004, together with Ana Paula Baltazar, she founded the research group MAM, M-O-M, Morar de Outras Maneiras, in Portuguese, Living in Other Ways, in English. So this research group focuses on autonomous production of urban and domestic space, particularly at the social and spatial margins, such as favelas and urban peripheries, indigenous, quilombola, and Romani communities, and on the role that technical advisory can play in these contexts. Since 2011, the group has been part of the Brazilian network on housing and social technology with several projects related to the technical advisory practices, social spatial pedagogy, and the creation of interfaces. Drawing on the group's empirical research, Silke has been developing a critical theory of architecture in dialogue with theoretical works of authors such as Marx, Morris, Adorno, Marcuse, Sérgio Ferro, Frederic, and Illich. She's part of the International Network for Production Studies, which recently had a project translating Ferro, Transforming Knowledges of Architecture, Design and Labour, approved by the British Arts and Humanities Research Council. So, welcome, Silke, and thanks again for being here.
Thank you so much, Mariana. Thank you all, by the way. I'm really glad to be here today, even in such strange circumstances. I think that as people in research and practices directly related to space, they are probably struggling even more than all the other people with this strange situation and limited access to the city, to field work, to construction sites, or simply to places to meet people. But at least this has opened up some opportunities for dialogue across spatial contexts, which would probably not have happened before. So I thank you very much. And excuse my accent, I will try to be as clear as possible. And at least in the beginning, I will read partly what I have prepared. So I will talk for a while, and then I think it will be nice if we could discuss all this. So your call for this conference states that architecture as a cultural product is often seen as unrelated to housing as a socio-economic need, even by designers themselves. This is absolutely true. Our field tends to see itself as part of culture, not as part of the economy, or more precisely as part of the building industry. Even the architect and sociologist Gary Stevens, who has analyzed architecture as a social field with concepts taken from Pierre Bourdieu, focused only on symbolic capital or the logic of a so-called symbolic economy, but never on economic economy, so to speak. Now, I would like to add another observation to your statement that architecture tends to be seen as unrelated to housing. Whenever the architectural field opens up to social engagement, this topic is the one which appears first on the agenda, housing. After all, it seems to be a need that affects everyone and whose conditions very directly and clearly express social inequalities. So socially engaged architects are committed to solving people's housing problems. They assume that a society, or we assume that a society which could provide reasonable housing for everyone would already be a substantial improvement to our actual situation. We envision architectural products for such a state of things. We discuss designs of housing units, neighborhoods, and urban facilities. And sometimes we also go for flexibility and participation in our design processes. Yet what truly counts for such approaches are, in the end products and their qualities or shortcomings. We focus on how forms and functions will be received, interpreted, and understood by inhabitants, visitors, passers-by, and quite importantly also by fellow specialists. We prioritize reception over production. Or as economists would say, we prioritize consumption over production. And there seems to be a good reason for this. Production may take a few years, but this is not much compared to how long a building or neighborhood will stand and affect people's lives. Even so, I propose to shift the debate from reception to production, because production, I mean, material and social relations of production do not just affect people's lives, but actually define them. What I mean is not only the production of architectural designs as such, but the whole complex network of factors and agents involved in concrete spatial transformations. Environment, policies, laws, capital, finances, financialization, grassroots movements, and most importantly, citizens as productive political agents and workers on real construction sites. The main reason for this shift is that most formal or legal production of housing reinforce the very inequalities that our best designs are supposed to counter. By concentrating efforts on the reception side, we take on board, unknowingly, I would say, a series of preconditions that are causes of social inequality. We assume, for instance, that design, construction, and use have to be quite strictly separated, not only in time, but also on an institutional level. This is not a requirement of human existence on our planet, nor a technical requirement of building construction in general. It's a requirement of the commodity form. It allows that the same social group or class takes on different roles in production and consumption. A social housing project may benefit people as users or consumers and at the same time explore them as producers. Any profit-oriented production employs workers at a wage level well below the value created by their labor power. This is the most basic principle of capitalism and has defined the organization and division of labor all over the place, no matter if a particular building site is profit-oriented or not. The most well-intended and perfectly designed housing project with participatory methods, adaptability, and any other feature we can imagine to improve inhabitants' lives reinforces unjust social structures as long as it is built by conventional processes. So instead of taking these processes for granted, it may be useful to look at them more closely. I propose to do this by drafting a brief picture of the production of dwelling spaces in Brazil, starting in the 1960s and then kind of jumping to today, and also looking at how architects and the architectural field have been involved in each case. I'm not going to talk about numbers, such as statistics of housing shortage, for instance, nor about solutions for better housing design. The point is to elucidate the logic that defines the production of dwelling space under different social circumstances. And I will try to show that there are prospects for a fundamental change in the field of architecture. It points to an emancipatory approach as opposed to the somewhat dictatorial role of classical or modern geniuses. The logic and key concepts that I'm going to talk about probably do apply to other places and social formations as far as they are part of capitalist societies, but a few words about where I am may be useful. So let me share screen here. I hope this works. So this is the city of Belo Horizonte, a metropolitan region in the southeast of Brazil with 5 million people, 34 municipalities and dozens of mining areas all around. As Mariana has already said, I'm based at the School of Architecture of a public university. And we have a research group there since 2004 called MOM, which in Portuguese is an acronym for Living in Other Ways. I must stress that what I'm bringing along today are samples of a collective research carried out together with many dear colleagues and students, which are not all in this picture, but anyway. And before I start, I would also like to explain one aspect of the Brazilian context, which maybe is different from other places. Here, urban land development and building construction are not necessarily combined operations. They can be, as happens in some gated communities and social housing projects, as the one you see here at the left side. In this case, a single agent, the state or a private company, for instance, is responsible for the whole project, producing urban space and buildings at once in a relatively short period of time. Yet the most common procedure is to develop building land as plots, which are then gradually sold and occupied by individual owners according to their particular means and interests. The second column here. This can take quite some time. And then there are areas occupied informally and before any urban development at the right. Houses and some infrastructure are built without a master plan, step by step, by many actors over a long period of time. Later on, the state may, may intervene, evicting people or improving their urban infrastructure, or using the urban infrastructure improvement to evict people. And this is basically, this third way is basically what we call favelas. All these different situations also entail a range of more or less visible illegalities related to land property, parceling, infrastructure, and buildings as such. There is no strict division between a formal or legal city and an informal or illegal one, as the most famous images of Brazilian favelas tend to suggest. High-income gated communities occupying protected areas are not uncommon, as well as informal developments by organized urban movements, for instance. So, okay, let's take a look back. Just recently, a smart student of mine, Fernando Soares, has called my attention to a text written by Lina Bobardi in 1951. It's named "Why the People Are Architects." Lina had visited a factory worker, a woman who had self-built her house. And then she wrote, Lina wrote the following: "The poor are architects because they do not have rich people's fancy ideas about the house. The poor know how much a smooth wall costs. The rich think about the finishing of a smooth wall. So the state of mind is different from the start and leads to two completely different products. In the first case, simplicity, rationality, logical construction. In the second case, complication, irrationality, construction spoiled by decoration." Lina was probably one of the first to look at this kind of production as architecture, and I would ask you to do the same. Instead of taking architecture as design or drawing, let us take it as transformation of space by human labor. Okay, I'm jumping to the 60s. The 60s in Brazil had begun with a political crisis due to the resignation of President Jânio Quadros. His successor, the slightly more leftist João Goulart, called Jango, was determined to carry out so-called basic reforms or grassroots reforms until he was deposed by the military coup in 1964. By then, Brazilian urban population had doubled in 10 years, and around 70% of that population lived with an income below the poverty line. By the way, the concept of a poverty line had just been invented, meaning the international recognition of a global society in which money is the only way to survive as a human being, while, as Ivan Illich puts it, actual subsistence activities came to be labeled as subhuman. As far as housing policies are concerned, one of the reforms planned by Goulart's administration was the so-called urban reform, aimed at regulating and redistributing urban land together with a range of housing programs. The military dictatorship took up some of these ideas and already in its first year created a national housing bank. The discourse was social, but in practice, it benefited almost exclusively the construction industry and the middle class. Social housing production by the state was not quantitatively relevant. So, in 1969, the architect, painter, and theorist Sérgio Ferro wrote a description and analysis of housing production in Brazil, pointing out the most typical forms, roughly corresponding to the poor, the elite, and the middle class. Ferro makes precisely the shift of focus that I have mentioned before, from products to social and material production of architecture. Ferro is actually still active, and he has written a quite impressive work since that time, mobilizing the critique of political economy for architecture in a wholly new understanding. And as Mariana also has already mentioned, we have just launched this project coordinated by Katie Lloyd Thomas in Britain and João Marcos Lopes in São Paulo to translate Ferro's writings to English and to expand and consolidate this field of production studies. So coming back to this piece of 1906, Ferro there calls the most common form of housing provision simply the popular house. It accounted for 70 to 90% of all households. As in other Latin American countries, such houses used to be nearly always self-built and in areas that had been completely left aside by bigger capitals and the state, or had been poorly developed by smaller capitals. There are indeed a few initiatives and cases of groups who self-organized in cooperatives or associations, purchasing a piece of land even at that time, and then parceling and occupying it together. But anyway, we are talking about settlements with almost no urban infrastructure. So Ferro describes these self-builders as using simple materials and techniques like wattle and daub, and inherited from rural backgrounds, and gradually incorporating also some urban resources and materials. The point is that financing, planning, logistics, and everything else was done by the family according to what they could manage. So, for instance, self-builders almost never used materials that could not be acquired, transported, and applied in small amounts, step by step, like bricks. Their houses used to be tiny, fulfilling basic function, a kitchen, one or two other rooms, maybe more or less improvised toilet outside, but no running water, sewage, electricity, and often no public transport or any other facility. Such self-built houses could, of course, be sold sooner or later, becoming commodities, but they were not produced as such, nor did their production involve extraction of surplus value from other people's labor. Their builders owned what they had produced. At least in theory, by selling it, they would recover the value that they had spent on means and materials and the value they had created in the labor process. We may say that labor in self-building was not alienated in the double sense of not being sold and not being senseless. This was the upside of self-building. Its downside lies in its consequences for the economic position of the working class as a whole. Self-building tends to reduce the reproduction costs of labor and therefore pushes down wages. As people find non-capitalist ways to cope with their housing needs, such needs no longer enter the wage bill. Indeed, this is the paradox of self-building, or for that matter, of any individual or collective self-help under capitalism. Self-planting, self-cooking, self-sewing, self-medicine, self-education, and all the rest of it. It means working for oneself or for one's group and not for an employer, having some autonomy to decide what to do, and also keeping the value that has been produced. At the same time, it means reducing the amount of goods that workers will have to pay for. And as they are able to survive on lower wages, their self-help favors capital. Capitalism in so-called developing countries is based on this logic. Common sense calls it simply abundance of cheap labor. So what about architects and urban planners in that context of popular housing production? Usually they did not take part in it. neither had interest in doing so. Informal settlements were not even on the map. But there are some important exceptions of professional students and scholars who, just as Lina Bobardi and Sérgio Ferro himself, began to do research in these popular spaces. They also started debates about politics and policies and new kinds of professional services with participatory or even emancipatory approaches. We call it technical advisory or technical assistance, and I'm coming back to this later. But again, it was not relevant in quantitative terms. Another typical form of housing provision, accurately described by Ferro in the 60s, is what he calls the mansion or the very expensive production for a very small elite. It does not concern us much here, except for one aspect. In the realm of habitation, this was and presumably still is the kind of production favored by architectural education and professional practice. In economic terms, this production takes part of the profit made in other sectors and spends it at what Marx calls revenue, or the representational costs of capital. Bourdieu would call it a conversion of economic capital into social and cultural capital. Anyway, the mansion must express the importance and uniqueness of its owner, assuring him credit and power to find or create new sources of profit. The typical rich owner would hire an army of professionals, artists and craftsmen to achieve a work of art. I'm sorry. He would behave towards his architect like a Renaissance patron. Yet there are differences. He would always keep in mind that this work of art may eventually be reconverted into productive capital. His house has to be unique, but not so unique that it could not be sold to one of his peers. Despite all the fine materials and specially crafted details, the whole thing seldom becomes an architectural masterpiece. But sometimes it does. And then it is very effective to promote new materials, techniques, and forms. As for land or neighborhood, the mansion owner of the 60s still had no gated community to choose. He would occupy the best parts of the inner city, where prices were high enough to guarantee his distance to other classes. And then we have the mass market. Why is this not working? Yes. The third form of housing production in Brazil in the 60s was for the middle class. Ferro names it by an oxymoron, the narrow mass market. In fact, it accounted for no more than 10 to 30% of all households. But this type of relatively legal production was indeed the only one in the housing sector organized as capitalist production in the strict sense. Here, so to speak, the mansion owner and the dweller of the self-built popular house come together as capital and labor. What was the role of architects in this case? The field would discuss mass housing sometimes as an important social issue, also because it was a priority at the international agenda, and because the hope for state subsidies to produce housing for everyone had never been fully abandoned. But all in all, designing for this kind of production was not a particularly prestigious job. Architects working for contractors or real estate developers would rather be seen as lacking talent or connections or both. On the other hand, architectural design, and I mean drawings, planning, specifications, calculations, and all the rest of it, This design, in a broad sense, was and still is absolutely crucial for this kind of production. Not primarily because it makes its commodities nicer or easier to sell. Even a bad design fulfills its function as a means to dominate the labor process. Let me explain this just a bit further. Capitalist production in the strict sense means capital buying commodities, as you know, means of production and labor power, bringing them together and transforming them into a new commodity of greater value than the value initially invested. We associate this logic primarily with large-scale industry and machinery, but mass housing in the 60s, as well as most building construction even today, is not done in factories. It was what the critique of political economy specifies as manufacture. The word is a bit tricky. In English, it means machine production, whereas in Portuguese, for instance, it is used as a synonym for handicraft. But in Marxian language, manufacture lies historically and technically between these two. It means processes still based on handicraft, but organized in hierarchical structures with a strong division of labor and under an authority outside the labor process itself. So it's a factory without machines, so to speak. One central insight of Ferro's analysis, which he later expanded considerably, is that architectural design functions as a tool for organizing and subordinating workers who in principle could do the job autonomously, keeping them in dark about the final product and the totality of the process, dividing up tasks and teams, codifying information into technical language. All that is necessary for capital to take command. What Marx says about the historical period of manufacture seems to be still true in building construction. So I quote from Capital chapter about division of labor and manufacture. He says, since handicraft skill is the foundation of manufacture, and since the mechanism of manufacture as a whole possesses no objective framework which would be independent of the workers themselves as machinery, for instance, capital is constantly compelled to wrestle with the I'm sorry. I would just get some water. So this is domestic production of keyword of Keynote presentation. Sorry. So let's go back to Marx. Again, he says, since handicraft skill is the foundation of manufacture, and since the mechanisms of manufacture as a whole possesses no objective framework which would be independent of the workers themselves, capital is constantly compelled to wrestle with the insubordination of the workers. Hence, the complaint that the workers lack discipline runs through the whole of the period of manufacture. I think we could add that this complaint runs through the whole construction industry even today. So considering architectural design from this perspective fundamentally changes our heroic or romantic beliefs. There is not only a distance between design and construction, there is an ongoing struggle of the kind that Hegel calls contradiction. I hope that now my former statement has become clear. On the production side, conventional housing development reinforces the very inequalities that our best designs try to counter. As you probably know, Brazilian military dictatorship ended in 1985, and a new constitution followed in 1988, establishing more rights for minorities and low-income communities, as well as channels for popular participation. In spite of global neoliberalism, this constitution followed a welfare state model with several implications for formal and informal production of spaces of habitation. The urban reform agenda of the early 60s re-emerged, resulting in a chapter on urban policies in the Constitution, an amendment on social rights on housing, and in 2001, by the enactment of the City Statute. This new legal framework made it mandatory to recognize and regularize informal settlements to provide housing for everyone and to restrain urban land speculation. However, the Constitution also gave autonomy to the municipalities. It granted general social rights and at the same time shifted the responsibility for implementing them onto the local level. Any urban right has to be regulated and implemented at that level. This has been difficult in large cities and almost impossible in smaller ones. The creation of a Ministry of Cities when President Lula took office in 2003 was an attempt to address such difficulties. But looking at all this 20 years later, it seems that we have spent too much energy on legal struggles while actual urban transformations went on in the opposite direction. Not to mention that many of the achievements are threatened now by the far-right President Bolsonaro and his allies. Anyway, the legal and institutional framework must be accounted as a major change compared to the 60s, for instance. Another important actor since that time are social movements. They had been quite strong in the early 60s and have never disappeared in spite of being harshly suppressed by the military. Their role in the redemocratization process was crucial. Since the late 80s, they have managed to carry out some paradigmatic experiences in housing production. We call them Autogestan or self-management, which means that people organized in associations or cooperatives receive public funding but stay in charge of the whole process from design to construction. Ideally, they choose their technical support, architects and other professionals. They make decisions, they manage the building site and take part in it. Especially in the 90s, these experiences opened up a prospect for a new kind of production. The most significant of them took place in São Paulo, and with the technical advisory from the collective Usina, founded by the architects João Marcos Lopes, Wagner Germano, and Mário Braga in 1990. But also in Belo Horizonte and in other places, we have had inspiring cases of this kind of production. The paradox is that the Workers' Party's administration did improve many people's lives with economic growth, social programs against poverty, more access to public education, support for minorities, etc. There was, on one side, real progress in the fight against social inequality. Between 2003 and 2014, absolute poverty in Brazil went down from 28% to 8%. Now it's constantly growing again. But on the other hand, there is still much to criticize in PT's urban and housing policies. Its programs and institutional participation channels have in some way reduced the autonomy and energy of grassroots organizations, not to mention that it did nothing to combat the financialization of real estate in Brazilian cities. The weaker local administrations and social movements are, the more aggressively financial capital has captured its spaces. Then in 2007, Lula launched the Growth Acceleration Program, PAC, which among other things aimed at informal settlements. Instead of extending self-management to these communities, respecting what they had achieved over the past decades and increasing their autonomy and spatial agency, PAC interventions mainly relied on construction companies aggressively opening streets, evicting people, and imposing formal standards. Then in 2009, to cope with the global financial crisis, Lula launched the housing program, My House, My Life. Its terrible name already indicates that this was not about the city, neither about any collective organization. Although the significant public investment in social housing pleased many people, it destroyed participatory structures which had been built up for decades. Huge construction companies now appeared as central agents for new developments planned in sets of 500 housing units each, and with very small margins for any site-specific differences. In its second edition, the program, in the second edition of the program, Housing Movements actually managed to get a small part of its fundings for self-managed developments. But the program had already been entirely structured according to the routines of conventional contractors and building companies, making it very difficult to carry on with real self-management. At the same time, dissidents of the more institutionalized movements formed new ones to actively resist the established order. In Belo Horizonte, for instance, PT, the Workers' Party, took office in the early 90s, creating a participatory housing system. 10 years later, part of the grassroots organizations, tired of waiting for their turn, started urban occupations, taking over empty areas, mostly private properties, parceling and occupying them in a very short period of time, and then resisting and fighting in courts for their right to stay. So let's look again at the former categories of housing production. What Ferro had called the narrow mass market, i.e. capitalist production of real estate, is not narrow anymore. Major construction companies opened their capital and formed land reserves and rationalized, as they say, their production processes. While construction capital of the 60s was still in some way intertwined with the spaces that it transformed, this is no longer the case. It's really what Henri Lefebvre calls production of abstract space. Capitalist production has enlarged in its original middle-class public, but it also took over part of the mansion public, so to speak, and part of the former self-building public. Former mansion owners became consumers of apartment buildings, gated communities, and a global market of luxury goods, including international real estate. In Brazilian cities, gated communities, the expression of self-segregation, are almost the only so-called urban space that they use and care about. City centers are no longer attractive and tend to have much empty dwelling space, which on the other hand is hardly affordable for the social classes and fractions that would need them. At the other end of the income spectrum, a relatively affordable formal housing market has been established. But even in informal settlements, there has been much building by companies according to the same logic. So what about self-builders? For the most part, especially in larger cities, they do not build anymore. They have become, we call it self-producers. This means that they still manage their own designs, planning, logistics, and so on, but hire other people to do the construction work as such. Self-building accounts for no more than 20% of building construction, even in informal areas. So your call of papers also stresses, and the whole conference stresses, the importance of our terminology. I think that this is an exemplary case. When someone says self-building, what comes to our minds is this anachronistic image of a family laying bricks. Even knowing that this is no longer the case, the word self-building is still used in academic debates and also in public administrations to kind of designating the whole building sector, the whole informal building sector. So programs and interventions are often designed to help self-builders or to teach self-builders how to build and so on, instead of understanding more closely what is actually happening. I'm not saying that there are no self-builders anymore, but they are not the majority of these informal productions. By the way, Capital has already understood the difference between self-builders as such and self-producers who organize everything but do not build. A new branch is emerging, selling ready products and services and calling themselves social businesses. This change to self-production, as you maybe can see here, entails also changes of techniques and materials. Hiring people with construction skills opens up a whole range of new possibilities, multi-story buildings, complicated structures, and so on. At the same time, things can still be decided and put into practice much more quickly than in the formal city, as there is literally no paperwork to do. The 21st century favela has its own dynamic. I brought you here a quite typical case of, this is a house, it had been purchased by a woman and her kids in 1973. And here you can see that during the 70s, 80s, and even 90s, they just improved it a little bit, enlarged it a little bit. But then since 2003, when the economy boomed and all these social programs and so on were there, their situation has changed completely. And now this is a 4-story building with much space, and they are even thinking about selling part of it and so on. So it's a completely different dynamic from what usually is understood as self-building. So what happened to the architects along this transformation, also considering that the number of architecture schools and graduated architects in Brazil has increased enormously since the 60s, becoming more diverse, less elitist. Roughly speaking, the amount of rich private clients in proportion to the amount of architects has diminished, and the mass market has become more standardized, offering few exciting design opportunities. At the same time, the demand for urban planning has increased due to the city statute and the new institutional framework. I should have mentioned before that the architectural education in Brazil is traditionally includes what we call urbanism, which is urban design, and to a certain extent also urban planning. But until the 90s, this was not a very prestigious discipline. Nobody cared too much about it compared to architectural design as such. But since the year 2000, or even since the 90s, this has become much more prominent. So anyway, the field of architecture in this new picture including education and research, is now more socially oriented than in the past. This is evident at a formal or administrative level, but there are also many students and academics and practitioners engaged in grassroots movements, urban resistance, and participatory processes. So the idea of extending architectural services to a wider public is on our agenda. However, some fundamentals of traditional design doctrines have been preserved in most schools, and I think also in the field as such. Ideally, an architectural object is supposed to be a kind of work of art with an authorship, an inner logic or integrity that must not be changed by its user, at least not beyond the margins of flexibility provided for. As far as housing is concerned, this entails two paradigmatic situations. The wealthy private client, who will also be a user, or the institutional client, such as a company or a state, who will decide but not use the space that is being produced. In the first case, architects typically listen to the client's request, create a form for them, which, if they are competent and lucky, gets the client's approval. And after some struggling about one or the other detail, some changes during construction and so on, there it is, a work of art, or at least a work of architecture. In the second case, the traditional assumption would be that architects know the user's needs better than the users themselves and will care for them as far as their budget allows. Yet the notion of authorship and integrity of the architectural work persists. Paradoxically, this context of traditional ideals combined with a more social orientation of the profession and a greater social diversity of graduate architects shows potential for opposing developments. In one direction, there is this possibility of just reproducing traditional procedures on a larger scale. It means offering lower income customers basically the same services as usual. One family, one architect, one design, individual ownership, clients as customers, not as political agents, no organized collectives or grassroots movements, focus on private space, not on public or shared spaces, a design to satisfy the user's needs once and for all, technical drawings, and a building process that follows them, regardless of conditions such as self-building or self-producing. This concept, mainly supported by professional associations, dates also back to the 60s and reappeared in the 80s, and in 2008 eventually gave rise to a law that entitles, I quote, families with a monthly income of up to three minimum wages to free public technical assistance for the design and construction of their own dwelling. In short, architects and engineers would be paid by the state to provide their normal, ordinary, common, conventional, traditional services to families who could not otherwise afford these services. Obviously, the law can be used for other purposes also, but this was kind of the idea of its creation. It's a bit the model of universal healthcare. But anyway, what I wish to stress here is the assumption that the best that architects can do for housing would be to design people's dwelling spaces, and this would already be an improvement for their lives. The The opposite approach has evolved in the context of housing movements and self-management. It means seeing the housing question as an essentially political issue taking the fight for rights, and especially the fight for urban land, as central and focusing on material production rather than design as such, and collective agency rather than private services. It means relying less on the state and more on autonomous groups. This second approach may entail a fundamental transformation in the field of architecture and urbanism, even more fundamental than the change that we identify with modern movements. This transformation must be understood, discussed, and I believe it must also be defended against those who want to suppress, ironize, neutralize, or absorb it. So the classical figure of the architect worked for privileged groups, designing spaces for equally privileged uses, symbolic representation of privileges, and even if not consciously, for the accumulation of capital through subordination of material labor. Anything other than extraordinary spaces was not of his concern. Then, out of urbanization and industrialization, a second type emerged, the modern architect, who designs all kinds of urban and domestic spaces, but despite a larger public of users, is still hired by dominant interests, and his decisions are still made together with socially dominant groups. So this modern architect kind of helps to ensure general production conditions, accommodating workers where they were needed or are needed, and alleviating the effects of structural contradictions. The new constellation could lead or can lead to a kind of architect who works for socially dominated groups and against domination. Now, okay, you may say that participatory approaches in Europe in the 60s already had this prospect. But in fact, they cared about users without caring about producers. The topics used to be in this, the topics in this context used to be happiness, functionality, perception, environmental psychology, and the image of the city and all the rest of it, you know it. But the point is to understand people as producers of space, not as users or consumers, and to develop ways of technical support to strengthen them. It is not about beautiful architectural objects, but about strong people, strong groups. So far, we have had experiences of working with and for social movements. I already organized groups, or with single families in case of this more conventional technical support. Now, a very important issue is about other communities or groups which have not yet organized themselves. A key concept in this realm is the notion of socio-spatial groups. They are the ones that this new kind of architect or architectural service should be for. What we call socio-spatial group is more than just a social group. It is a group of people that relate to one another in a space which is constitutive of the group and conversely constituted by the group. The link between space and social nexus is necessary and dialectical. Necessary because the group would not exist without this spatial nexus, and dialectical because it is tensioned and always in process. In Henri Lefebvre's language, a socio-spatial group would be a group that produces a space and is produced by a space. A group that is able to constitute itself by producing a space or has the prospect of doing so will contain an idea of autonomy, however fragile this idea may be. So technical advisory practices strive to strengthen this autonomy. So this is basically the work that we have trying to advance in the last 15 years. And I can show you maybe some examples of little things that we have done. I don't know about our time. What do you think, Mariana?
It was around 1 hour for your talk, and then we have some time for debate. So since we started a little bit later, if you want to show the images, and then we open for discussion.
I will just show these images very quickly, and then we can start talking. This is about, this is such a group, and it's in a very small town, but this is just to show some procedures to make them map their own area by themselves. If you are interested, we can detail how to do this in our discussion. This year's another group of here, they call themselves gypsies because they are actually not Roman, but from another ethnic group, which is called Calon. And so this is a housing project also for this community. And here we develop some interfaces for them to design their own houses, which they actually also built later on. And here, these are some instruments together with this model making tool where you can quantify materials and so on. So to make it easier, you have to consider that these people are mostly illiterate, but this kind of language is quite useful for them. This is another game, and it was more for kind of socio-spatial pedagogy, so to speak. This group is one of the one who did organized occupations, so-called organized urban occupations. And this was just to show them how they could manage the infrastructure that they would build by themselves, and how they could organize their housing units in space and so on. This year is in another smaller town, and it was more about making people conscious of some urban problems. I can also explain how this worked later if you want. And this year is a very nice project which started with one of our students, Karina Guedes, and it's now a kind of NGO, or I don't even know the exact, or cooperative or whatever, but this is to teach groups of women how to design and build, if they want, or just supervise building labor of other people, which in this case will be mostly men. And this is really has been a very incredible thing. Like here you can see this was the first experience of forming these groups, and then they learned how to measure and draw their own houses and see what they would change and what would be interesting to change and so on. And then later on, they also learned some construction skills and did a lot of these changes. It was incredibly empowering, this kind of experience, and I can also explain it later. So let's leave it there. Thank you. And
thank you so much for your talk. It was, as I predicted in the beginning, since I know you, I know your work, a very good contribution. I was just wondering what my colleagues here think about it. But what I would like to say just before we open for questions, we are open for questions. Please feel free to send your questions and in writing at any time. And it will be possible for you also to speak if you prepare. if you prefer, you just can't unfortunately see it, but we will be able to listen to you as well, so as you wish. So thank you so much, Silke, for doing this effort of going in such a calm way through so complicated topics, and from the 60s until now, and from theoretical challenges and perspectives to practice, including your own practice as a professor, as a practitioner. So I think that was very interesting. Also, thanks for suggesting this kind of shift or constructing with us different point of view to see the same kind of discussions we've been trying to do here, from reception to production, or trying to articulate both, from user to producers, also trying to articulate both. Also for showing us some more perspectives on what architects have been trying to do as practitioners, as working in this technical advisory organizations, such as you mentioned, Usina. Also connecting architecture to space, production of architecture, but production of space as well. How we produce space, groups produce space and are produced by space, bringing Lefebvre as well. Perhaps one of the challenges is how people can learn more about Sérgio Ferro work, and it's nice that you are working on this translation project. We mentioned it one of the sessions. And part of his work, very small part, I think, is already available in English. I will send the link here, if you don't mind, because it's in your website.
Yes,
I think it's here. It's one of his texts, so if you want to make any comment on it so that people will understand what's in this link, what they will get if they want. And there are texts available in French, since we have like many people here from Europe that probably can read French as well, and that are not already translated into English. So that's also something that you could perhaps let us know, or let the group know what is possible to read, since your main theoretical reference was this author that for us is so important, or for part of us, as you said, it's kind of diverse perspectives on what's architecture, what's the connection between architects and housing, and so on. There is a lot of debates on that, of course, in Brazil. Sérgio Ferro himself took part in this discussion in the 60s, and as you know, it's a debate in Brazil. So, but how we can do that, and it's also interesting that you showed a little bit what happened in Brazil. Although we have this important reference of how to try to build a different perspective towards architecture. We also had this in the last few years, this very controversial housing program that is hard to criticize because like millions of houses were built. So how can you say something bad about housing being built if we're here talking about housing? And you gave some elements. It's very hard in my talk. It's amazing how you managed to do it, but to give an approach, critical overview of this housing program, I'm sure that's something that can be debated if people want. So, and you also, by bringing the discussion to the present, you mentioned also connections between capital, land, working site, building site, techniques, and architecture as one of the elements of this complex of building the cities and the houses. Of course, a very important part of it, at least for us, but it's part of it, and there are many other subjects of these processes, and you highlighted one of them that's very important, and sometimes it's invisible, which is the worker in the building site. So that's just a few comments, and I would like to to ask if any one of the colleagues want to ask questions or to from the research group, or to make any comment, or any of the participants here. And before that, if you can already start just saying how can we, or people who got interested in reading more about Sérgio Ferro's work, how can they do it?
There is actually one chapter which has been translated, or one text which has been translated in a book called Industries of Architecture. This was published in 2016 after a conference which took place in Newcastle. And this is, it has this French name, Des Sans Chantier, because in English it's difficult to design, and construction site is not so charming as Des Sans Chantier in French. But there, Sérgio Ferro, this is a kind of an introduction to his theory. And then we have translated into English a piece which had actually not been published in Portuguese in this newer and more detailed version, which is called Concrete as Weapon. And there he tries to show how concrete, reinforced concrete since the 19th century was not actually about, wow, new technology, new designs, how nice, but about labor struggles. It kind of entered, and so this is a very impressive piece, and I would really recommend you. Mariana has already shared a link where you can find it. We have written a short introduction to his work for this piece. And we, meaning myself and João Marcos and Katie Lloyd Thomas, which are the two leaders of this translation project. As far as I know, we have just these two texts in English so far, but yes, this one. Very good, exactly.
Thank you, Silke. Vanessa Grossman also added something here in the chat. Vanessa, I don't know if you want to talk about it. Yael, how do we manage this? If someone wants to talk?
I will just let Vanessa talk.
Okay. As meaning in technical, if there is anything we should do, or Vanessa, you can just talk.
Vanessa, you can unmute yourself and then.
Okay. She has a technical problem now, but Vanessa gave a talk. She presented a paper on mutirão, very interesting about the term mutirão, and so perhaps she can share something about it later.
Question from Priscilla, if you would like to read it.
So we have a question here. Thank you very much for this fascinating presentation. Do you think that this transformation of the housing sector through the evolution of capitalism is unique to Brazil, or has it happened in other countries in a similar way? I'm referring to the self-building sector. Have you expanded your research to other countries?
Yeah. Very good question. Very nice. Actually, I think that Latin American countries are very similar in this regard. I don't know much about African countries or even Asian countries and other places, but in Latin America, I'm sure that the structures of these transformations are really similar. There are some interesting experiences also in Cuba. Cuba, you say, sorry, and because they kind of organized this in a bit different way. And yes, and for the rest of it, I think that what we are seeing now what Ferro calls mass market, or what I would simply call a capitalist production of housing, sold to the free market or to the state directly, is what is happening here has happened maybe in Europe and other places in the global north 50 years before or something. It's not, this part of the whole thing is not very different. It's only the strange point is that I lived for 1 year in Berlin, in Germany, and it was incredibly difficult to explain what I was even talking about. When you say, oh, architectural design dominates, subordinates material work on site, a kind of work which used to be very interesting, very skilled, and very everything. And then people said, no, but these people are all happy. There's nothing to complain about. This is not a problem. But actually, if you look in every single European country, it seems that building workers are always migrants, poorly paid, not very well respected, with some exceptions, obviously, and so on. So this is not just an issue for the global south or an underdeveloped country, so to speak.
Yeah, there was a discussion at Columbia University. I joined a few years ago a group who builds our architecture that discussed that. I think I just put the link here. I hope it's the right link. I got it very quickly. But it was that discussion that even in rich countries or in central countries, building sites often have this kind of conjunctions, like with immigrants working and so on. Or in Dubai, for instance, that they get the passports as soon as they enter in the country. But in Brazil, perhaps you can make some comment on that, considering the workforce, the workers in construction are kind of entry level in wages. So.
Could you say this again?
It's even I think the working conditions, even comparing to the other countries, to central countries, to even if the legal immigrants in other countries, the working conditions and the wages in Brazil are lower. That's what I meant.
Yeah, probably yes. But I think that for me, what is most important is the structure of the whole thing, you know? When I said before that we try to do the best houses and something very nice and incredible so that people will be happy or will have a nice communal life and so on. But still, if we don't address the issue of having the whole housing production based on subordinated labor and so on, this will never kind of solve anything. So, for instance, imagine a housing program as huge as Minha Casa Minha Vida, this My House My Life program, but based on building cooperatives. Not that the future dwellers should necessarily build. I'm not saying this. But you could have an organization, incredibly interesting organization of people who now work as subordinated people and very badly paid people, and maybe learning new techniques and learning how to kind of manage their own cooperatives or organizations for production. This would mean, I think, important social changes, not just in consumption, but in production. And maybe it was so easy for this Bolsonaro government to revert all the many of the achievements made before, because all these achievements were very much based on consumption, having more things to consume, which is all right. Okay, I'm not against it, absolutely. But I think that this is maybe not our main problem.
You mean we had more housing being built, but we didn't challenge, we tried to, but we didn't challenge the building site. So it's not just about labor conditions, but it's also about a critique on labor division, isn't it? A division of labor in the working site. And in that way, it's also a critique, or at least put into question the way we think of the discipline of architecture as something that's separate from the building site. That's why I think you explained that in the beginning in the introduction of Sérgio Ferro text. It's considered such as a radical perspective on it, because it challenges the discipline itself. I don't know if Yael you wanted to say something.
Q&A. A question from Nimrod Regev. He asked, how do you accommodate traditional building techniques with land scarcity and multi-level construction?
I can't see this one.
It's in the QA. It's a different track. I will put it in the same one in the...
No, it's okay. So the question is about traditional building techniques and multi-story building, is it?
It is about traditional building techniques with land scarcity and multi-level construction.
Yeah.
I think Nimrod is referring to the house, the incremental increase in development by the residents.
Look, informal construction in Brazil is actually no longer uses traditional techniques in the sense of vernacular techniques. We call this kind of evolution metropolitan vernacular, which is an informal appropriation of industrialized materials and resources and machinery and so on. So I would say that this kind of organization of labor in building sites, but also together with the people who design, the people who will use it, and so on, is not necessarily related to traditional techniques. It can be, but it can also be very, very sophisticated. It can be very, very sophisticated techniques. And about the land scarcity, I think one problem in the international debate related to Brazil is that most people who participate or take part in this kind of discussion come from São Paulo or Rio de Janeiro or some other big city, but mostly these two. And this is really an issue, and there's almost no land to occupy anymore. But in most other parts of this whole country, there is space that could be occupied if it's sometimes just occupied by financial capital so far, but there could be done many things. It's not that, it's impossible to do anything because now all the place is full and we can't construct it anymore. I think this is really not the case. And we have a very high vacancy. You call it vacancy, isn't it? Also, which is even higher than the housing deficit. It's not that the people who now have no dwellings or no places to live could just get these empty spaces, but actually there has to be done something to mobilize this part again into a market, which I don't know. For me, I would prefer a revolution, but okay, there will not be a revolution now. So let's see what we can do.
We have a question from Eduardo. Eduardo, you can unmute yourself and speak. No?
I would have a question, but I think there was somebody else.
No, go ahead, Suzanne.
Okay, thank you so much for the very thought-provoking intervention. I noted big, let's redefine architecture as the transformation of space by human labor. I think that's going to be the key quote I will take away. My question is prompted a little bit by this role of the state. I mean, you just addressed it, that Bolsonaro was able to revert past policies. Your argument is because it was based more on consumption than on production. I'm assuming because the people who benefited from these programs weren't really involved in the production process. But I would still say that any change needs the state. So where do you see the role of the state? I mean, if you're calling for relying more on autonomous groups, there's also a limit. There's a limit to how much autonomous groups can do financially, legally. So where do you see the role of the state?
Look, in the 60s, John Turner, this British architect, he had already all this discourse about self-building and so on. You probably know it. But he was, he just kind of ignored the whole economic dynamic of it, so that in the 90s or even in the 80s, when the states were no longer willing to invest any money in social programs, then it was just about, oh, okay, they will be autonomous, so let them do whatever they want. So they have total autonomy as far in their poverty, so to speak. And then when some money appears, the autonomy disappears. And I think that my point is basically, if they can be self-managed or to a certain extent autonomous when there is no money, which is exactly what Bolsonaro is doing now, because, oh no, I'm not investing too much in let these people do it autonomously in a way. So my point is, let's foster this autonomy or this possibility when there are social programs and investments into these kind of improvements, and not the other way around. I think this is the point. There is a very nice text by Marcelo Lopes de Souza, which is called With the State, Despite the State, Against the State, or something like this. You can find it in this City journal. It's called City or Cities. I think Cities, yeah. There he kind of details. The point is, you cannot just say, oh, this is my position towards the state. In some situations, you have to go with the state or count on the state to do something, and sometimes not. Yeah. And also, I think that it's very important to mention that the state is not one block. There are many different actors inside this state organizations.
You also mentioned that when you talked about the city law, and that basically there's suddenly a federal law, but the implementation is left to the local level, and that brings certain problems.
Yeah, exactly. And even at the local level, you find people who are absolutely progressive and willing to do many things, and other people who are not. Even the bureaucrats and technocrats and so on. So I think that, now before revolution, we will have to count on the state at some level, but not in this kind of, I don't know how to say this in English, paternalistic way, maybe.
No, that's not what I'm talking about. I just think, I've sort of studied cooperatives in different countries, and essentially they can't flourish if there's not a strong legal and financial and political will to make them flourish. even if the cooperatives think they're autonomous, even if that's the discourse, and even if the state can say, these are independent groups, but without that backing, it all stays. It's a trickle of small voluntary efforts that
never last long. Actually, yeah, you are right.
Priscilla, please go ahead.
Thank you. Sorry, thank you, Silke. I'm Brazilian, but I'm studying Tanzania and self-building in Tanzania, and so it's in a way it's similar to what you were describing before the 1960s, with 90% being self-built, but I actually mix the self-building for one's own consumption, or the contracting of a contractor. So, but it is still at this stage. And then I was just, the one thing is that on the one hand, I struggle to bring materials about the mutirões and self-construction in Brazil that I think are quite relevant to the African continent. It's so unknown, so I take like the 2 papers, or sometimes I ask Mariana for, there's capacetes, which color, Mariana? Capacetes?
The documentary movie?
Documentary?
Capacetes Coloridos by Paula Constante.
Yeah, Capacetes Coloridos, which there is an excerpt in, we have subtitles. But anyway, so that's one thing that I think the experience is very relevant, but there's very little material. But again, I think that, and I was talking about that yesterday, that this is seen as a transitory stage that policies and a lot of the profession want to overcome and formalize, and I wonder if there's a way to shift that. At least, that's what I'm trying to do with the research. I mean, our group is trying to do with the research is to understand this as a model that can continue in the future. So anyway, do you have any comment about that?
Yeah, it's strange because people usually think, or I would say architects usually think, oh, there will be progress if these people stop to do any self-production, be it self-building or not, and have this kind of formal procedure of someone professionally designing for them, then they may build and so on, and even have all the formal papers needed for it. And I think this is exactly the point. This approach is just, we are just kind of imposing on people certain standards which will make them more dependent than before on professional services and so on. I like Ivan Illich very much. I don't know if you know him. And he wrote a lot about this idea of shadow work and dependencies, and he has actually also a very interesting text called Needs. It's just needs. And there he kind of explains how this idea, which came about, I think before the 50s, there was nothing like this kind of discourse, because even in Europe, many people were doing things quite independently. And then in the second half of the 20th century, you have this ideology of everybody being taken care of some external organization, and that all these people self-building or self-doing whatever, they are actually very poor and very bad off and so on. So let's provide them with some commodities in the end, you know. And I think this is more the basics that I would look in a different way. Yeah.
Yeah, just a quick reaction. I think it has to do very much with those residents being inserted in a market, in the housing market, in the urban market. And then, like you were saying, they cannot be the self-builders because then they're not consumers, right,
Mm-hmm.
of a housing market. But it's quite unrealistic. And then for organizations such as the UN Habitat, for example, for what it's worth, the UN Habitat keeps promoting the idea that we have to expand private markets. And
yeah, but at least we could, instead of, for instance, companies for profit or financialized companies, which is much more than that, it could also be popular cooperatives or things where people could make a living and have some work which makes sense. Because otherwise you have to provide these commodities again and again and again and again, you know. So yeah.
So if I could ask, or maybe, so if we think about Polanyi's argument about land that land should not be a commodity, and if we are reminded of the mission of planning for workers in the beginning and the middle of the 20th century as attempts to provide outlets for worker housing outside of the market, then we are placed actually against the legacy of modernist architecture. And so we do have some inspiration or some historical references or some legacy within our discipline not that long ago, right? And so and part of them, as we have been mentioning several times during this conference, this process has been part of the modernization of our discipline. So this has been a significant in the way architects understand what is it that we do in the world and who are our clients and what is our premise. And so the question is, how can we rethink this legacy? How can we open it up again, invent new design methods that adapt to the contemporary neoliberal context, where the commodification of land and of housing seems inevitable. But is it inevitable, right? Architects have been involved in taking housing and land outside of the market before, in order to make more people, in order to make the general public, to give the general public access. So, and since you're working with students and as an active architect, I would, and you know, you do have in your talk, you were very clear on the beginning of such, I don't know, provocations, let's say, or attempts. If you could elaborate on this, I would really appreciate it.
As I said, I don't think that modern architecture is particularly progressive, or was at any point. Actually, in the 20s, there were some initiatives, really interesting ones, which have been completely forgotten by architectural history or historiography. So this image of the conventional modern architect, so to speak, he would be someone, it's always a man, the image is always a man, But yes, he would care about the users or the people or the population or the general public and so on. But in the end, he is very authoritarian, and not only towards the users. This has been criticized in the 60s or since the 60s, but also towards the whole working class, if you want, you know. So I would really not take this modern architect as a model for, I think we could do much better, you know.
I agree with you that we could do much better. I do think that the history of modern architecture for worker housing is more, I mean, the delicacy of the narrative is broader than the 1960s critique of the modernist architect who is, in a sense, working for the state and is being very authoritative. So in the case study that I'm researching in Israel-Palestine, we have many examples of architecture by modernist architects that was pretty meager and not about grand gestures for the state, and that attempted to solve problems, right, in all kinds of both capitalist and communal settings. And these have been co-opted by all kinds of powers, the state, of course, significantly, as Suzanne was pointing out, and in a sense, lost some of its capacities and probably needs to be regained or rethought if we want to act on housing for the masses, right? And so the question is, but the conditions have changed dramatically. So we know if we want to act now, we need to understand the current conditions and the possibilities for us to act within these specific conditions. And I think that your work is really important in showing just like the small cracks where we can start acting.
Yes, it would be wonderful if we could bring these little pieces of 20th century practices which are not so prominent in our history, if we could bring them together, you know. I have found some pieces which are wonderful, not just of architecture, but also of writing, for instance, and ideas about how to deal with this. But it's quite the opposite of this Le Corbusier, Bauhaus, etc. thing, you know. And it would be wonderful to find more of these and put them together and show, oh, it's not like this. Yeah.
Maybe
Go ahead.
No, maybe just a suggestion as a way to think about what you're talking about. I think that I think that certainly modernist architects had all sorts of interesting ideas, but they were also playing the game of creating a profession within a capitalist society. And that requires certain moves, certain power moves that I think, Silke, what you're pointing out very rightly, are problematic when it comes to actually constructing houses. In other words, part of, you know, it's about giving up power in a way that is even more, that is very real if we want to be involved in things such as what you're talking about.
Yes, that's why I think that architecture has to become feminist in a way.
That's another way of saying let's give up power. So again,
that's terrible. I'm sorry.
No, I was just trying to suggest a term that would balance between, because it seems to me that you're having a slightly different conversation. One is about what do we need to do so as to produce housing, and the other is what do architects need to do. And I think those are not quite the same question, because the minute you bring in architects, you're bringing in a group of people who, whether they want to or not, also have to defend their turf and to defend their profession and to have a discipline and to have knowledge. And, you know, it comes with the territory of defining yourself as an architect. If you're defining yourself as someone who's going to promote housing, a lot of that goes away. So again, just a theoretical conversation rather than taking one side.
Yeah. But I just think that we could kind of expand this knowledge for a much more democratic way of producing space, so to speak. Let's say, okay, architecture is transformation of space by human labor, and architects may even still be, in a way, specialists in this kind of transformation. But they could be much smarter than just like designing.
I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm just my own work. In my own work, I've studied architects who tried to give up the knowledge and tried to share the power in the United States in the 50s and 60s. And I think many of them are still committed to that, but they got a very big backlash from other people within the profession who said, wait a minute, not in these words, but was like, wait a minute, you're taking away what we're about. I guess what I'm trying to say is that there's place for both conversations, just to recognize that they might not be the same. That's it.
Very good point.
I mean, here it's only 1:20, but isn't it super late in other parts of the world?
We are 8 minutes from, really closing this this session that has been going for almost 2.5 hours. So we can just see if there are any additional questions from the audience. Suzanne, do you have a question? No? Okay. Let's see if we have any additional questions.
Can I make a comment? Sorry, I'll make it briefly, but I just I think it's also important to consider the level of informality. The role of the architect, I think it changes so much in this predominantly majority informal environments, also because there's not a whole lot of work, formal work for architects, and which opens a window of opportunity to review the role of the architect, not and beyond teaching and giving technical assistance, but really like observing what people do and then thinking about then what do you do. I don't know. I think I've been living in this, I've been living in this environment for a long time. So my framing of the architecture has changed significantly. I think because of the level of informality that I work with. So I just wanted to bring that up to differentiate with those more formal environments that other people are operating.
Yes, yes, you're right. I really thought that we would have 1 hour and a half, but this was actually 2 hours. So I could even have shown you some more things, but it's nice. Let's hear what all this approach. Sometimes it has to be a bit exaggerated a bit, or the whole discussion, because otherwise people just interpret whatever you say in the same pattern according to the same standards which they already believe in or which they already practice. So sure, I'm not saying, oh, now let's go everybody to the building site and share power or whatever, but I think we we should look at this whole situation in another way. And I have already heard many discussions about housing and these issues, because it's also in the media and everywhere. And the question seems to be just, how to design the nicest houses, or how to get land so that people can have these houses, which is an important question, obviously. But the point is, the kind of production of space in general and in social perspective, and also in the material perspective, material production itself, this defines where people stand in the social structure or hierarchy. So I think that if we can make some effort to think about this and change this even also in practice, it would really make a difference. But there's much to do. This is why we are doing production studies. You know, this is the idea of production studies.
Thank you so much, Silke. I think there is not a question, but a request from Vanessa. Can you possibly name this? And I don't know if that was for Abigail or for Silke. Perhaps the name of the architects, Abigail, we mentioned.
I don't know.
I think maybe it was the architects, one earlier, the architects in the 20s and 30s that were doing interesting things where you feel like that's the story that needs to be told rather than not told.
That makes more sense. Thank you, Suzanne.
Oh, yeah. There is one guy, for instance, who later came to the Bauhaus. And I'm not remembering his name now, but he's even quite famous. And before going to the Bauhaus, in 1970, he wrote, for instance, a wonderful piece about architecture as an art, claiming for kind of collective building sites for utopian inventions and so on. And then later in the 20s, he wrote another text which is very, very conservative in a way. And I'm sorry, but now my head is kind of failing. And yeah, but this is one example. Other examples are, for instance, a guy here in Belo Horizonte at the beginning of the century. This was a carpenter, and he wrote some very interesting things about building sites and knowledge about the knowledge of related to building and so on. And we actually nobody never sees this kind of text. And you must know that in the beginning of the at the beginning of the century, a carpenter would still be or was still allowed to name himself an architect. Only in the 30s here in Brazil, it was regulated who can call himself an architect and who cannot, and so on. So, I mean, this kind of things, it's not something very famous and it's difficult to find, but maybe we could make a conjoint effort to bring these things together, you know. I'm sorry, but now I can't remember specific names.
Thank you so much. I think we have just 1 minute left. I don't know if Yael or someone from the group would like to close the session.
Go ahead.
Sure. Okay, so I was just trying to put, I found the film mentioned by Priscilla with subtitles, but it's not working now, the chat. I can send you later if anyone wants to write me. I can do it. I didn't introduce myself in the beginning. My name is Mariana Fix, so let's do it in the last minute. And marianafix@gmail.com. And also be pleased to send you if you want any of the other texts mentioned here, and including the film and more material on the subject. But most important, I would like to thank you very much, Silke, again for her effort of being here, sharing with us this amazing talk, and I hope we have the chance to discuss more some aspect of it in the next few days. I hope to see all of you tomorrow, isn't it? I won't say the time because that means it's a different perspective from each location. But I hope to see you tomorrow in the sessions. Silke, would you like to say something more before we finish?
Yes, just thank you. It was very nice meeting you all. It would be wonderful if we could in some way continue this discussion, and really great. And thanks very much for listening.
You are most welcome to come at any time also during the conference.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
Okay, bye.